If ever there was a trip of a lifetime, this has got to be it. Starting from Ushuaia in the southern tip of South America, we travel first to the Falkland Islands, then to South Georgia, then to the South Shetland Islands, and then on to the Antarctic Peninsula and some of the islands that surround the peninsula, and finally back to Ushuaia in South America. All with this taking almost 3 weeks, covering thousands and thousands of miles.
Okay, this is Ushuaia, our very first full day. We're down at the ship's harbor, and all the ships are gathered here now, having just returned from Antarctica. And it's a beautiful day. We'll be boarding later. So we will be heading out. This is the main town of Ushuaia. And the beautiful mountains looking toward where our hotel is.
There's something exciting about going to sea anytime, but to go to sea from a place whose signpost says the end of the earth is especially exciting because we're heading south from here through the Beagle Passage to the Antarctic Peninsula via, as I said, the Falkland Islands, South Georgia, the South Shetlands, and some other intermediate destinations along the way. This is going to be a phenomenal trip, and even just sailing out of the channel, we saw all manner of birds and beautiful sights as the sun slowly began to set on the first day of our adventure. Our first day and night at sea were a little bit rock and roll, and some people managed to get seasick almost immediately on leaving port. But eventually we approached the Falkland Islands, and the ship's zodiacs began to go out and do some reconnoitering on the best place to land. Our first landing on the Falkland Islands was in the New Island Nature Reserve, the northern part of it. There's also a southern part that we made landfall in a little later. The Northern Nature Reserve is the home of the Rockhopper Penguins, and they're pretty well named because as you watch them are hopping around from rock to rock, they're somewhat colorful. They've got a little bit of a pretty colored eyebrow, but they're very interesting, very active, and rather small, maybe 2.5 feet tall. In the South Wildlife Reserve, we ran into our first land-bound albatross, the black-browed albatross. These little critters were nesting, and so it was interesting to watch them and the chicks. These are one of the birds where if the chick is blown out of the nest or falls out of the nest, the albatross doesn't know enough to understand that it's their chick, and they'll just watch it there while it starves to death or dies of exposure. Fortunately, nobody fell out of the nest while we were there. The Falklands are inhabited, of course, by people who are largely of British descent. This was the scene of the famous Falkland Islands War between the British and the Argentines over the ownership of the island. The Argentines called it the Malvinas. The Falkland Islands look, during the summer season at least, pretty idyllic and interesting, but you can see from the trees that there is a lot of wind here, and the waterfowl and the other creatures are fairly diverse in terms of seabirds, but we really didn't see much in terms of land animals anywhere in the islands. So the sights and sounds of the islands are pretty much the sights and sounds of the subpolar islands that you'd find anywhere in the world, except that there's an occasional penguin thrown in. Our first sight of South Georgia comes in the early morning as we're skimming along the islands here to the west and north of the main island of South Georgia.
This is South Georgia. A little overcast right now, but the sun is coming up. We're cruising to a bay to take a Zodiac trip. Beautiful mountains. Water's a little rough, that's why we couldn't make our first landing. Some more of South Georgia. On the other side, we're still cruising to our destination, Right Whale Bay, to try to make a landing. Sun is shining a little more now.
Our first actual landing is going to take place on South Georgia at Right Whale Bay, which is in the northern part of the island you can see here with the oval. Obviously there's a lot of steps involved in the landing. One of them is to get the landing bridge down, the stairway down from the ship, and we have to kind of work our way into the harbor. They send people ashore in Zodiacs to make sure that they can find a safe landing spot for us. This is going to be a combination of a king penguin colony and the southern fur seals.
We just arrived on South Georgia Island. Penguins.
The penguins have no fear of humans at all. The southern fur seals don't like anything. Even the little pups will try to nip on your ankles as you go by.
King penguins. Ship.
Seal tempers seem to be all right as long as you're not too close to them. You can see that the weather at least is decent. The ship in the distance is pretty clear, and despite the fact that we had a kind of a threatening warning, we're having a nice day.
Another section of the landing site, and there is just more penguins than the eye can see. Seal here, lolling in the grass. Lots of seals. I'm just standing there with the paddle board. This is where the king penguin chicks are. They're the ones with the furry brown coats. They'll be in the process of molting. Some of them are in various stages of molting. This fellow here just has his head left to molt. Looks like we're going to go up this mountain here. These are the chicks that are molting.
King penguins are what I think are the most attractive of all of the penguins. They have a beautiful shark skin kind of a coat. They've got a bright orange and some yellow on their heads. And they're also a very interesting bird. They're the largest next to the emperor penguins. They live in enormous colonies of up to 140, 150,000 breeding pairs plus chicks. So you can imagine the noise and the smell is pretty intense while you're visiting them. If you're visiting a king penguin colony at the right time, which fortunately we were, you'll get to see the parents feeding the chicks. You'll see the parents and the chicks kind of huddled together. There's some that are still sitting eggs. And when they return from fishing, one parent or the other will greet the returning parent with a nice little gesture. The seals, of course, are not quite so delightful.
There are the penguins going into the water.
This little guy wants a taste of human.
They just stopped moving, little mob here.
We're now moving on to our second landing site on South Georgia, which is Preon Island, and then onward from there to the Bay of Isles. On Preon Island, we're going to see some albatross, and in the Bay of Isles, we're going to see a very large king penguin colony, and of course, more of the southern fur seals.
This is a blonde seal.
We're welcomed on Preon Island by an albino seal pup, by a penguin, and by a climb that we had to make to get up to the top of the ridge where we found some more nesting albatrosses. And again, it's amazing that these birds don't show any sign of fear or even interest in us as we walk around them. On the way down, we encountered our usual southern fur seal, but he wasn't aggressive, and we did get an opportunity from the top of the ridge to view the beautiful area of the Bay of Isles in what was some of the nicest weather we had in all of South Georgia. Then moved on to a landing in the Bay of Isles.
This is a Gentoo penguin with a baby.
The Bay of Isles is a broad open bay, and inside there's a landing area where you get an opportunity to see a lot of different critters. Here we see Gentoo penguins first, young, and the parents feeding them. We also saw the inevitable southern fur seals, and we saw some of the king penguins playing in the surf. You can see in the background in this area how broad and spacious the bay is, and also how gorgeous the surroundings are. The day is still pretty, but it's clouding up just a titch, as it sometimes does in the late afternoons and in going on to the evenings in the southern polar area. Now we come to the serious hiking part of the trip. This map shows where Shackleton crossed this peninsula on his way from his lost shipmates on Antarctica up to the whaling station in Cridwicken. We're going to retrace that portion of his route. We came ashore as usual in the Zodiacs in a wet landing, and we made our way along the beach. We couldn't come ashore at exactly the point where Shackleton had crossed over because there were a lot of southern fur seals and some of the people were very concerned about them. But we did encounter some of the elephant seals who were playing their usual jousting games. Once we moved past the elephant seals, we were able to start climbing up a very grassy, kind of a wet slope. This is defrosted permafrost, and it was fairly slippery. And we climbed this until we reached the top of the ridge. What goes up must come down, of course, and so we had to descend an equally slippery grassy slope on the other side, down to a stream, and then, of course, on the other side of the stream, there was another hill. And that kind of told the story of our crossing of the peninsula here. It was a series of downhill, uphill runs, sometimes slippery, sometimes covered with shale. We had a pretty nice view of the bay that we had just departed from. The ship, of course, at this point, it had to leave us and was working its way around out to sea and then around the peninsula back into the bay at Cridwicken. In the meantime, of course, we had to take the slightly dicier route up and over. We came across a little lake in the middle of a kind of a scree-covered area, and from the area around the lake, we were able to see ahead to the bay at Cridwicken itself, which was a relief because this was an arduous trip. We came then to the biggest downhill climb that we had to do, which was a scree slope, went down into the valley that you can see in the image. And this was a little bit of a challenge to traverse, even if you didn't have gear on. And of course, carrying backpacks and everything, it was a greater challenge. But once we got through that portion, we could see the whaling station at Cridwicken ahead. We worked our way across the grassy meadows to the port, and there the Zodiacs met us to take us back out to the ship, which had by this time worked its way around to meet us. And from the ship we could see the town of, or sort of town of Cridwicken, and we could also see Shackleton's grave. Shackleton died of a heart attack on South Georgia on a later expedition, and he asked to be buried in this location. The whaling station is about what you would expect the whaling station to look like. There is a little museum here, and the British after the Falklands War keep a warship in the harbor here just in case there's further problem with the Argentines. That night we had a lovely barbecue on the deck of the ship as we pulled out of the harbor and made our way to our next stop, which would be our last stop in South Georgia.
We are now in the tail, some of the southern point of South Georgia, and we are going to be going up a fjord.
As you can see, our last stop in South Georgia is the very southern tip of the island, which is Cooper Bay. In Cooper Bay, we managed to find some of the Macaroni penguins, which are probably, at least in terms of their headgear, the most colorful of all the penguins. This was also kind of a difficult trip for me. It was hiking up muddy trails. I did manage to fall once. I had to clean penguin dung off of my camera, but it was worth it. These are beautiful, beautiful animals, and the view from up on the bluff where they were found was spectacular. The Macaroni penguins nest in the reeds, and the reeds make it a little bit difficult to get a clear shot, but because they're not shy, we were able to get some angles and manage to get some good pictures. You can see from the photographs why they call them Macaroni penguins, because the headgear resembles some kind of a pasta. On the way down from the penguins, we worked our way through grassy areas, and from the distance we could see some of the seabirds trying to attack young seals, which they were fortunately not strong enough to be able to really injure. We also ran into some of their larger relatives who showed their usual displeasure at having us around. Once we got back on board ship, we now headed out through the islands from Cooper Bay, and you could see small bays with birds and icebergs, and you could see penguins running along ice floes. It was overall a gorgeous way to end what was a wonderful visit to South Georgia. We found South Georgia to be the most fascinating of the destinations on the whole trip. So let's get a little perspective here. This is South Georgia where we're departing. The circle at the bottom here is the Antarctic Peninsula, which is ultimately where we're going to end up. And the South Shetland Islands, which is where we're going next, is this circle in the middle. We crossed an area of open ocean and saw some icebergs and some other pretty scenery. Eventually we came into the area of the South Shetland Islands, and this is a very lonely outpost seemingly in the middle of nowhere, except that there's an Argentine Antarctica station that's located here. Ironically, their own supply ship had not been able to reach them, so we were the first people who had actually seen these people in about a year.
Okay, this is our visit to Antarctica, the Argentine station. This is the back part of the bay, not the main bay where the station is located, but the other one across the sand spit. You can see the sea here is still frozen. Some glaciers there, some humans.
Life in the Antarctic is death in the Antarctic as well, and you see graveyards in many places, including here. But most of the area is more cheerful, and obviously the people in the Argentine station were rather happy to see us since they hadn't seen anybody else in such a long time. Inside the station was warm and comfortable. You can see that the exterior of the station is well kept and so forth. And these people and other countries' stations also perform basic research on Antarctica, on the cold, on the climate, and increasingly on the geology and the glaciology. As we moved away from the base, you can see that area in the little circle there. We're coming in now to the really heavy ice area of Antarctica where the big bergs are likely to break off.
Mother of all icebergs. Stretches from right about this point here, heading along with the horizon. Next is the weather. Clouds are like These all the way to there, down here. An angle of about 5 degrees.
This is another very big iceberg trailing off into the almost invisible distance on the right here. And as it gets closer to us, it's becoming more visible. In this area here, zoom in and actually see some features on it. This one is about 22 miles by about 6 miles. This is the first sighting of the Antarctic continent itself. We've just seen some orcas. See, there's still quite a bit of shelf ice. Some very nice icebergs. Various distances.
Peninsula. As you can see, it is quite large. More of the icebergs near the peninsula.
These ice floes are gigantic, but we're also getting ready to get to the main part of the trip, which is the Antarctic Peninsula itself. And as it begins to fall into evening on this day, we know the next day we're going to actually see the peninsula. Okay, we were up here in the South Shetlands, and now we're going over to here, which is Brown Bluffs on the Antarctic Peninsula. The Antarctic Peninsula and Brown Bluffs area come into view, and so does one of the larger ships that comes through Antarctica. The problem with these larger ships is that there's so many passengers on them that you can't get them off and on safely, so the people have to do a drive by Antarctica instead of going ashore. We see some penguins diving off icebergs. We also see some krill, the major food of the whales in this area. And we got some close-up looks of the icebergs as we moved in toward Brown Bluffs itself, which is obviously from the image here pretty well named. Going ashore onto Brown Bluffs is our first touch on the Antarctic Peninsula. Another wet landing and a triumphant arrival on Antarctica, demonstrating the value of our Neos boots.
We have now officially landed on Antarctica. We are at Brown Bluff. We'll see some Adelaide Penguins here. Our first official landing on Antarctica. These are the Adelaide Penguins. Now this is a gentoo. This is a little gentoo colony with the babies. Can't get too close so it doesn't upset the babies. This is a gentoo colony with the furry babies. As far as the eye can see.
There's no question that penguins are cute. These are the Adelaide Penguins. They're the ones that we saw the most on the Antarctic Peninsula. The Peninsula Penguins tend to be a little bit different than the ones that we saw in South Georgia, which were primarily the king penguins. It's not particularly cold here on the Antarctic Peninsula. During the summer, the temperature gets as high as in the 40-degree range. You can see though that you've got to be fairly well bundled up, not so much against the cold, but against the possibility that you would get wet during the landing. The ship is of course maintaining a position off the beach fairly close to make sure that if somebody does fall in or get wet or get hurt or something like that, they can be quickly evacuated. And there is a doctor aboard the ship. We're now going to leave the peninsula for a short period of time to go to Deception Island, which is a fairly famous volcanic island off the coast of Antarctica, where the volcanic eruptions have been recent enough and their magma is still close enough to the surface that the sands are actually warm to the touch.
This is the Antarctic Peninsula, and we are heading towards a place called Cuberville for one of our last or two landings. Absolutely gorgeous.
This circle shows Deception Island, which is an island off of the coast of the Antarctic Peninsula. It's a caldera, and as you can see, ships can sail into it, and inside the waters are fairly calm. Deception Island used to be a whaling station, and while we don't approve of whaling as a general policy, it's hard not to feel sorry for the people who were here. This is obviously an incredibly desolate place to live, and probably an even worse place to die and be buried. There's still a lot of the ruins of the old whaling station found here, and as in many other cases in both the northern and southern polar regions, the area is just too distant from civilization and too expensive to get to for anyone to be willing to clean it up, even if you could find people who were responsible. There are plenty of old artifacts here to look at, but the more adventurous dug a bathtub out of the sand and put their bathing suits on and kind of laid in the sand and eventually went into the water, which is probably about 45 degrees, to cool off again after their warm bath. After this particular stop in Deception Island, we're going to move on to our last stop on the Antarctic Peninsula, and in fact our last stop on the entire trip, which is going to be Paradise Harbour. On our way, we encountered some of the common inhabitants besides the seabirds that you always saw in the South Polar regions. One of them is the Humpback Whale. The whales are not particularly concerned about boats or people here, and so we were able to get fairly close to them, or actually they got close to us. We were sailing on a constant course and speed, which is what the Antarctic Treaty requires, and the whales just kind of came along and frolicked and played in our area. You get to Paradise Harbour by going through the Arera Channel. There's another one of the Antarctic stations from one of the Antarctic Treaty countries. It's located on the channel, and we pass it by on the way in. The weather looks like it's going to be gorgeous for Paradise Harbour, which is good because Paradise Harbour is probably the most striking thing that you can see on a typical Antarctica trip, a trip to the peninsula itself. As we enter Paradise Harbour, the area is calm enough because it's a harbour that we're able to take the Zodiacs out and kind of nose around through the area, looking at what's on the ice floes. One of the things that we find is the Leopard Seal. We also managed to find later on some of the Leopard Seals. The water was so calm in the harbour, and conditions for viewing in a single boat with more people in it were satisfactory. So to save launching a lot of boats and the time that it would cost, we put more people than usual into the Zodiacs. You can see the Leopard Seal here. This is an animal that's very fierce, a major predator of penguins, and it's really the only predator in a true sense that you find much around the Antarctic Peninsula. It's a beautiful animal, but it does look sinister when it's active, which doesn't happen to be what this one is. Back on the ship, we enjoyed a cup of hot chocolate with some schnapps and whipped cream, and everybody had a great time kind of frolicking around in what was a beautiful sunny day in one of the most arresting and majestic spots that we've ever been. Well, here we are. It's our last night in Antarctica. We're about to leave and cross the Drake Passage, and we're participating in a tradition that many small ship cruises have, which is the get-together on the bow of the ship for the passengers and crew to celebrate the time and adventures that we've shared. Our return passage to Ushuaia the following day across the dreaded Drake Passage turned out to be one of the calmest crossings of the whole trip. We jokingly called it the Drake Lake. But eventually we did end up in Ushuaia, arriving at the city as the sun went down and seeing a beautiful sunset as we pulled into the port at the end of our trip. This was probably the most magnificent adventure that we'd ever done, and probably one of the most that we ever will do. It's a rare opportunity to see a part of the world that most people never see, conditions that most people never live in, and animals and surroundings that are totally unique to us that are part of the civilized world. It was definitely worth the time and the effort, and we'd do it again in a heartbeat.